אייל, כדאי לשים את כולם על שתיקה?
הם נראים לי בהשתק, לא?
לא, לא כולם. We see people, by the way, if you're already here, you can definitely use the chat box to say hi and to say where you're from. I see someone from Halifax is saying hi. I see someone else that I know from, I think from Europe, I think it's from Amsterdam, a friend of mine. New Zealand, here we go.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
California.
Wow.
Australia. Wow. Very, very nice. The UK. Wonderful. Cape Town. Florida. Go Florida. More New Zealand, New Jersey, my home state. British Columbia. Wonderful. We'll wait another minute, right, Eyal?
New York.
Yes, everybody is in mute just for the beginning, and only the group that.
No, everybody should be in mute now, even our participants.
Wow.
Wonderful, wonderful. North Carolina. Nothing could be finer than to be in North Carolina. In the morning. Whoa, Haifa. Also nice. Okay, so it is now 8:32, and we have 140 participants, and I think that this is the perfect time to start. So here we go. So shalom everyone, and welcome to the Ghetto Fighters House virtual opening of a new art exhibit, The Memory Keeper, the Alphabet Series, by New Zealand artist Helene Carroll in partnership with the Aotearoa Museum. My name is Medine Shachar, and I am an educator at the Ghetto Fighters House, and I will be greeting you today. Our program is a new partnership with our friends in New Zealand who are with us today early in the morning. We are honored to have our friends from New Zealand in the audience today. I'm also happy to announce that Gad Proper, the Honorary Consul of New Zealand in Israel, is also with us today. Helen is sitting with Susanna Shabbolt, Director of the Aotearoa Museum, who is also with us, and Dorit Kraus-Gabay, who initiated and supported this exhibit. But before we start this special program today, some housekeeping notes. First of all, the program is being recorded and will be available via the Ghetto Fighters House YouTube channel in a few days. We will post a link in the chat box, and you can look for that on our channel. As you can all see, you've been put on mute in order to avoid unwanted noise during the program. And once again, as you are doing now, you can use the chat box to communicate and to send questions. And hopefully we'll have time at the end of the program to answer some of those questions. And now, I would like to invite Igal Cohen, Director of the Ghetto Fighters House, to open today's program. Igal?
Hello, everyone. I'm happy and excited to open the exhibition, The Memory Keeper, here at the Ghetto Fighters House in Israel. Welcome to all, and I'm proud to be hosting the Ambassador Gad Proper, the Honorable Consul of New Zealand in Israel, who is joining us. I would also like to welcome Eyal Shmueli, the Mayor of Kfar Vradim Municipality. We are very happy to have you with us tonight. This is a festive event that takes on new meaning from the very connection created between people from all over the world, between the Ghetto Fighters House in Israel and far away New Zealand. The exhibition, The Memory Keeper, expresses and brings with it a warm and moving human bond. This connects us precisely at a time when we are bound to social distancing and seculation. I want to thank you, Helen Carroll, for the work you have shared with us and the connection between the painful subject we try to approach and the world of childhood and innocence that is so present in your work. Many thanks to you, Dorit, for not giving up. Together, we fulfilled the dream of the exhibition existence, even if virtually, for now. Thank you very much, Lilach, our museum director, for the drive and the very existence of this special meeting. I invite you all to be a part of the Ghetto Fighters House virtually today, but soon in person. I wish you all an interesting program. Thank you, Maydeen.
Thank you, Igal. And now I would like to invite Dorit Kars-Gabay to say a few words. Dorit? We just have to get you unmuted.
Yeah.
Good. Nope, you're still in mute.
Perfect.
Good. Got you.
Okay. Dear Helen, Susanna, Gad, the Honorary Consul of New Zealand in Israel, the amazing staff of Ghetto Fighters House Museum, and all partners, friends, families who encouraged me on this journey. Good evening. Good evening also to Eyal Shmueli, head of Kfar Vradim Consul, and Sarit Poles, the artist and the teacher of art student from Amirim High School in Kfar Vradim. Opening an exhibition is always an exciting event, and this time I feel it is an extraordinarily exciting. To the English-speaking guests, I will say that I'm going to tell a short story, a fairy tale about the encounter with Helen and her work, and I will do so in Hebrew. The rest of the event will be held in English. אז שוב, ערב טוב לכולם. אני אספר איך עודד ואני נפגשנו עם הלן ובעלה גיל לפני שנתיים לגמרי במקרה. ביקור מקרי במוזיאון ארטורי, בעיירה קטנה בשם מאסטרטון, באי הצפוני בניו זילנד. לא ברור לי מה היה כל כך מטלטל עבורי במפגש הזה. אנשים מתרגשים מאומנות טובה בכל העולם. אבל זה היה מפגש מיוחד במינו. אולי העובדה שהיינו אחרי המון ימים בטבע הכי יפה בעולם, המון קילומטרים של נסיעה, מצב נפשי של ריחוק משגרת החיים הרגילה, הפניות, השלווה, הגעגועים ארצה. אולי הניגוד בין מה שציפיתי לראות, אומנות מאורית, ובין סדרת הציורים הצבעוניים, הכביכול נאיביים, עם מוטיבים מטלטלים מהשואה. זאת הייתה תחושה של תדהמה, הפתעה וסכין בלב. מה לשואה ולניו זילנד שבקצה העולם? למה שמישהו יבחר לעסוק בנושא השואה באופן פרדוקסלי וכמעט ילדותי דרך סדרת ציורים עם אותיות ABC, שכל ציור מחולק לחלק אופטימי, נאיבי מניו זילנד ומוטיב מטלטל וקשה מהשואה. ניסיתי לקרוא את מה שהיה כתוב על הקיר ולא הצלחתי. זה היה כמו לרפרף על מילים מבלי להבין את משמעותן. שאלתי את עובדת המוזיאון שישבה בקבלה. סיפרתי שאני מישראל, דור שני לניצולי שואה. היא ראתה שאני נסערת. חזרתי לציורים. היא רצה אחריי ואמרה שהלן ובעלה בדרך למוזיאון. נפגשנו. הספיקו 10 דקות בעמידה. סיפרנו קצת מי ומה. המבט היה מוכר. אני מכירה אותה. אני מכירה את הסיפור שלה. מכירה איך היא גדלה עם 2 הורים ניצולי שואה מפולין, שהכירו, התאהבו והתחתנו במחנה ריכוז, שלמרות הכל שרדו, שרצו להקים חיים חדשים במקום הכי רחוק מהתופת שחוו בעולם המפותח והנאור באירופה. הכל התבהר. אפשר לנסוע רחוק, אבל אי אפשר להתרחק ממי שאנחנו, וממה שאנחנו נושאות בתוכנו, הגורל המשותף של העם היהודי. ואחרי לילה ללא שינה נפלה ההחלטה להביא את הלן ועבודתה ארצה. מוזיאון בית לוחמי הגטאות הפך להיות הבית. הלן וגיל קנו כרטיסי טיסה לישראל. תכננו לחגוג ביחד את ליל הסדר, בדיוק לפני שנה. מוזיאון ארטוי השאיל את הציורים. הציורים נחתו בארץ באמצע מרץ וחיכו בתוך ארגזים. חיכו שתעבור השנה המוזרה, שפעם אולי נבין אותה. ועכשיו, גם אם הלן לא הגיעה פיזית לפתיחת התערוכה והמוזיאון, ולהשתתף באירועים שתוכננו איתה ברחבי הארץ לציון יום השואה, היא תספר עכשיו את סיפורה. אתם תכירו אותה, ולהמון אנשים בארץ תהיה ההזדמנות לעמוד מקרוב, ולהתרשם מהסיפור שלה כפי שמשתקף באומנות שלה. מסקרן אותי לראות מה הציורים יספרו למבקרים שיראו בארץ את התערוכה. אתם מוזמנים לבקר בתערוכה ולהגיד לי. אני מעבירה את רשות הדיבור ללילך אפרים, עוצרת ומנהלת חטיבת המוזיאון, שהייתה לי שותפה קרובה ומקור לעידוד ואופטימיות, בכל פעם שכמעט פתחנו וביטלנו 5-6 פעמים לפחות. תודה לילך.
אוקיי. So, good evening and shalom. I'm very excited to open the exhibition, The Memory Keeper by Helen Carroll at the Ghetto Fighter House. At this time, when the coronavirus struck the world and led to the closure of the cultural world and also the Ghetto Fighter House Museum, this event, even if it's held virtually, is exciting and special. We owe our thanks to three dear women, to Dorit Kraus-Gabay, who encountered the exhibition during a trip to New Zealand. Dorit was impressed by Helen's personal story as a daughter of the Holocaust survivors and her work, and decided that the Israeli audience must be exposed to this special exhibition. Dorit, your tremendous contribution in all aspects led to this achievement, and we thank you for that. Thank you, Susanna Shadbolt, Director of Art Is Museum in New Zealand, who graciously lent us the exhibition. Thank you wholeheartedly for giving cooperation and understanding. And thank you, Helen, for this special and exciting series of painting, for choosing to share with us, and for your valued guidance throughout the project. Helen Carroll chose to express her feeling through the language of art. We choose to display the painting as one sequence in ascending orders from A to Z. Playing the letters create a well-known and permanent sequence, a kind of lexicon for Helen's world, for those fragments of information that reach her as a child. The Ghetto Fighter House Museum followed in the footsteps of the GFH founders, who were committed to the urgent and important task of collecting and preserving the fragments of memory everywhere. Their insight created in the house became a treasure trove of remembrance. In its existence and contained, memory is preserved. The founders were the transmitters of memory. There are thousands of work in the art of collection at the Ghetto Fighter House. At the center are works created during the Holocaust in camps, ghettos, and hiding places. The collection was built out of desire to commemorate Jewish artists who perished and for the works to be testament to this period. Much was collected by Miriam Novich, the museum's first curator. She was ahead of her time in understanding that the art made by the persecuted by the Nazi terror was an expression of resistance. She coined the term spiritual resistance. The GFH marked Holocaust commemoration through art, created by the second generation as expression of such spirit. The Ghetto Fighter House is pleased to present The Memory Keeper by artist Helen Carroll, and cherish her contribution to the Holocaust remembrance. Miss Helen Carroll, please.
I can start now. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Helen Carroll aho. Shalom and warm greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. First of all, I would like to thank all of the people who have made this exhibition possible. Igal, Cohen, Lilach Ephraim, Dorit Kraus-Gabay, and Susanna Shadbolt, Director of Aotearoa Museum of Art and History. It is truly a great honor and privilege for me to be able to share my paintings with you in Israel. I will now tell you a little about my background and who I am, and share some of my family history. My maiden name is Hélène Renée Bant, Hadassah Rivka, named after my two grandmothers. I'm the only child of Leon Bant and Giza Seiden. My parents were both Polish Jews, my mother from Tarnów and my father from Auschwitz. They were both survivors of the Nazi concentration camps. My father was incarcerated in Płaszów and Gross-Rosen, and my mother was imprisoned in Płaszów, Auschwitz, and then Neustadt Glewe, a subcamp of Ravensbrück, from where she was liberated on May 2nd, 1945. I know very little about my parents' lives in Poland. Before the invasion of Poland and the outbreak of World War II, my father's family lived in Auschwitz. He was the youngest of a family of 6 or 7 children, and he had 2 or 3 brothers, 3 sisters, my aunts and uncles. I don't even know most of their names, and I have only one photograph of some of them. They were all murdered early on by the occupation forces. Some of my father's relatives left Poland before the Nazi invasion and settled in France, England, and Australia. My father spoke very little about his life in Poland and of his time in Gross-Rosen. He kept things very close to his chest, and I think repressed a lot of his memories, which possibly contributed to his early death. He was only 56 years old. One of my enduring memories from childhood was waking at night to the sounds of my father's cries and screams. He suffered from terrible recurring nightmares. My mother was very matter-of-fact about this and would comfort me by saying, "It's all right, darling. Daddy's dreaming about the dogs attacking him." I accepted this and thought that all fathers had bad dreams. My father had a tracery of scars on his back, probably from being beaten or bitten by dogs or both. My mother grew up in Tarnów. She had an older brother, Max, and her mother, Regina, was a cousin to my grandfather. My uncle Max studied and graduated in medicine at Warsaw University before going to Perugia in Italy to specialize in psychiatry. My mother had also commenced her university studies in Warsaw, but was unable to complete them as Jews were no longer permitted to attend university in Poland. At the outbreak of war, Max was forced to leave Italy and return to Poland. He joined the Red Cross and was killed in a bombing raid in the first few weeks of the war. My grandfather, Abraham, was visiting family in Rzeszów and became trapped beyond the Pale of Settlement when the Russians took control of eastern Poland. He spent the entire war behind Russian lines, enduring harshness and severe conditions as war raged around him. This left my mother, Giza, and my grandmother, Regina. They were forced to leave their home and the family business, a bookshop and a musical theatrical booking agency, and enter the Tarnów ghetto. My mother said that by the time they had been incarcerated in the ghetto, Regina was in a very poor state, traumatized and emotionally distraught. In the early days of the war, Giza was able to leave the ghetto to seek work. In mid-1942, on her return to the ghetto one day, she found that her mother had been taken away on an early transport to either Belzec or Treblinka. We don't really know exactly how she met her death. Possibly she was even murdered on the streets of Tarnów. Shortly after this, my mother met my father, who had fled from Auschwitz and ended up in the Tarnów ghetto. They were both alone, having lost their entire families. A whirlwind romance blossomed, and they were able to find comfort in one another. They were married by the rabbi in the ghetto on December 24th, 1942. I have a copy of their wedding certificate, one of the few documents we have from this time. From the Tarnów ghetto, they were transported to Płaszów concentration camp, where they became separated. They had made a pact that if they survived the war, they would return to Krakow and look for one another. After Płaszów, my mother was taken to Auschwitz, where she became a slave laborer for the rest of the war. She was tattooed A24064 on her arm. She attributes her survival to luck, her youth, and overall good health, and most importantly, to having a good friend with her for the whole period of her incarceration. They were able to support each other emotionally. In the closing weeks of the war, my mother was held at Neustadt Glewe, where she almost died from starvation, typhoid, and numerous other life-threatening complications. After hospitalization, she made her way back to Krakow, where she was reunited with her father and her husband. My parents tried to rebuild their lives in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. They spent around 18 months searching for surviving family and friends. They arrived in Munich, and shortly thereafter, my mother found that she was pregnant with me. Since they had no desire to have a baby in Germany, they managed to enter France. My father had family in Paris, and that was the reason I was born there, May 2nd, exactly 2 years after my mother's liberation. During our time in Paris, my father attended a trade school where he received training in the leather industry. This would turn out to be our meal ticket when we left France for New Zealand. My mother was not happy to stay in Europe and wanted to move away as far as possible. Her wish was granted when we received permission to go to New Zealand as displaced people. She had a cousin living in New Zealand who agreed to act as our family's guarantor. We set off in 1949 on the MV Luciano Manara, bound for the ends of the earth. On reaching the equator, my father threw all our warm clothing overboard in the belief that we would no longer need them in our new South Pacific home. Sadly, he was mistaken, and so the next stage of our lives began. My parents hit the road running. Rental accommodation was found. My father found work, and as soon as I was old enough, my mother also found employment. Now my life in New Zealand began with my grandfather, who spoke very little English, as my primary caregiver. I only spoke Polish until I started kindergarten. Learning English as a young child seemed effortless and something that happened seamlessly. By the time I was 4, I had taught myself to read, and it was through books that a whole new world opened up for me. I never felt lonely again. I learned how other people thought, behaved, and lived their lives. Growing up, I felt loved and cherished by the 3 adults in my life. By the time that I'd started primary school, I began to see that my family was very different from the families of my school friends. At the time, the 1950s, women didn't generally work, but stayed home to look after their children. My mother worked, and I was looked after by my grandfather. My clothes were sent to me by our relatives in Paris, so I was always differently dressed, and the food that we ate was different. Around this time, I refused to speak Polish in front of my school friends. If my parents addressed me in Polish, I would answer them in English. My parents spoke German when they talked about things that they didn't want me to know about. Through conversations that they had with their European friends, I slowly learned something of their experiences during the Holocaust. As I grew older, my mother told me stories about her time in the camps. She had a strong sense of the ridiculous and a great sense of humor. Some of her tales of life in Auschwitz were truly very funny in a black, dark way. The information that she shared with me was transmitted in small fragments with no linear connections. It was only as an adult that my reading on the Holocaust enabled me to piece together the horrific story. I'm so grateful for the things that she shared with me, and even more grateful for the things that she didn't. I was the only one of my generation to have survived in our family. I always sensed a very deep sadness and melancholy in my home, and I tried to remedy this by being funny, making jokes, and generally being entertaining. My parents worked hard, and I grew up in a stable, loving environment. I'm still amazed that my parents went through all that they did and survived with their spirits uncrushed, and that they were able to trust, love, and hope again. I'll now talk about my art practice. I came to painting later in my life. On leaving school, I went to Teachers Training College, where I trained to become a primary school teacher. I was fortunate to have some wonderful art teachers there, and that is probably where I became aware that the making of art was a possibility for me. I enrolled in night classes at the Polytechnic and started exploring drawing, painting, and ceramics. My 20s were taken up with the deaths of Jaju, my beloved grandfather, and my father, commencing teaching, my first marriage, and the births of my 3 daughters, and the death of the youngest one. In the aftermath of her death, I played with ceramics and found that the handling of clay was both therapeutic and soothing. I started to try and see what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I began talking to my mother about the past and trying to place myself within this rather fractured family history of ours. The one positive outcome of my baby's death was that it enabled my mother to cry. I had never seen her shed tears, and finally she was able to. Tears are cheap, she used to say. When Joanna died, she was finally able to weep for all the people she had lost. In my 30s, I embarked on the next stage of my life. The death of my child and the ensuing grief, divorce, the start of a new relationship, and a subsequent move to Sydney. It was when we lived in Sydney in the 80s and early 90s that my art practice really began. I enrolled in a community art school and studied painting, printmaking, collage, and ceramics. I began to see that the skills I was learning would serve to express some of the ideas that were central to my being. For the decade that we lived in Sydney, I became engaged with the making of images and developing a visual vocabulary with which to express my ideas. I began to exhibit my work in group exhibitions. Our time in Sydney came to an end when my mother became unwell and I wanted to move closer to her. We went back to New Zealand, leaving our daughters at university in Sydney. The subsequent decade was a very productive one for me. I worked as a teacher and continued to paint and started regularly to exhibit and sell my work through a dealer gallery in Wellington. At this time, I was lucky enough to be invited to exhibit in a joint show with an Australian artist at a public art gallery, Te Manawa, Palmerston North. This series of work was called My Father's Dreams. I think that it was with this work that I began to see that I was slowly beginning to build my own unique visual vocabulary with which to express my ideas. Up to this point in my life, I didn't have a clear notion of where home might be. During this period, we traveled to Europe and I visited Poland for the first time. Until now, I had thought that maybe Europe might be where I belonged. Visiting Poland had a profound effect on me. Poland felt familiar, yet at the same time totally alien. It was strange to visit a country where everyone spoke my mother tongue, but where I felt completely not at home. We made a trip following in my parents' footsteps. I spent a lot of time crying. We went to Auschwitz. It was high summer and the light was golden. There were wildflowers by the railway tracks and frogs mating noisily in the ditches. I rang my mother from Tarnow and told her that her house in Ulica Święta Anna still stood and that my grandfather's bookshop was now a pizzeria. On our return to New Zealand, I realized that the Pacific and the Antipodes were where my heart lay. Shortly after our return from Europe, I made a series of paintings entitled Kaddish for my family. I realized that no one would have recited Kaddish for all of my family who were murdered during the Holocaust. So these paintings were a small attempt to honor their memories. These paintings dealt with loss and darkness, but I also tried to imbue them with light and beauty. These works were a turning point for me as I realized that I had a responsibility to take on the mantle of memory keeper for my family. Elie Wiesel said, "Remember the past. We owe it not only to the living, but also to the dead. If we forget the dead, they will be killed a second time." I strive in my work to make something beautiful and accessible out of something ugly and impenetrable. And so life continued. My mother died. I continued to teach and to paint. And then in early 2004, we moved to Indonesia for a number of years, where I continued teaching and painting. Since returning from Asia, we have lived in a small rural town just north of Wellington. During this time, I've had 3 solo exhibitions at Aotearoa Museum of Art and History, the last of which was the Alphabet series in December through to March 2018-2019. And through sheer coincidence and serendipity, I met Dorrit Krause-Gabay and her husband, who happened to be visiting Aotearoa on their travels up the North Island. We spoke to one another briefly and felt an instant connection. I was very touched that my painting seemed to resonate with them. We exchanged contact details, and that was the beginning of a rather lengthy journey to get to where we are now, with the alphabet finally on display in Israel. I will now briefly talk about the alphabet paintings and then reflect on my latest work. Why an alphabet? The alphabet is a known structure which is constant and unchanging, whereas the Holocaust, for those who weren't there, is almost impossible to comprehend. It requires us to use our imagination. Using the alphabet as a scaffold from which to suspend my images continues along a path that I've been traveling on for a long time. The alphabet paintings have 2 distinct halves, a benign upper portion relating to my current here and now, and a darker, more sinister lower half relating to the history of the past. I liked the structure of an ABC as it seemed to be a good way of expressing the constant duality of my thoughts and preoccupations and my actual everyday life, the beauty and wonder of my present reality, and the blacker, darker obsessions and thoughts that have haunted me for most of my adult life. A is for apple and also for Auschwitz. In this painting, I have depicted the rail entrance at Auschwitz-Birkenau. I think that this would have been the view that would have greeted my mother on her arrival at that camp. Many children's ABCs start with A is for apple. The apple can represent innocence or even original sin. The apple sits on a fragment of Pacific patterned cloth, anchoring the image to my everyday here and now. B is for bird and also for Belzec. The bird is based on a Tongan peace dove motif, which I have appropriated and changed for my own purposes. The bird is flying above stylized New Zealand hills, and the blue sky is anchoring the painting to the Pacific, the Antipodes, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Belzec is one of the possible extermination camps that my grandmother Regina may have been sent to. The stones on the railway track speak of the permanence of memory. G is for grandfather and also for Ghetto. My Jaju was my primary caregiver when I was a child. He took his duties very seriously and was my protector and great love. I have painted him wearing a yarmulke and tallis. He was the only religious member of our small family. Because of him, we went to synagogue once a year on Yom Kippur, and he kept alive the Jewish festivals and cultural traditions in our home. In the image of the ghetto, I am particularly interested in the rather cynical signage, Wohngebiet der Juden betreten verboten, which translates as Jewish quarter, no entry, whereas the reality was that the Jews were not permitted to go out. The Polish, tylko dla Żydów, means only for Jews, suggesting that this might be a choice or a preferred option. H is for home and also for Holocaust. Home in this image refers to my mother's house at Ulica Święta Anna, number 9. I have often depicted the front door and facade of this building, which continues to stand to this day. The apartment and all her family's belongings were confiscated when the Nazis invaded Poland. My mother and grandmother were forcefully evicted from their home and incarcerated in the town of Ghetto. T is for tapa and also for tattoo. In all the alphabet paintings, I have used motifs and patterning from tapa cloth to frame the top half of these images, to make it clear that whilst these paintings deal with events from the past history in Eastern Europe, they were created here in the Pacific. Tapa is a cloth made from the bark of paper mulberry tree, and it is used throughout the Pacific Islands. My mother's arm bore the tattooed number A24064. I spent most of my childhood trying not to look at this. I'm not 100% sure if this is the correct number. By the time that I was an adult and ready to talk to her about it, the ink had faded and the numerals were no longer clear. Once when I was a child, a friend asked me if my mother couldn't remember her phone number. If you'd like to know more about these alphabet paintings, there is a YouTube clip that you could watch which goes into far more detail, either at Ellen Carroll, the Alphabet Paintings, or Aotearoa Museum of Art and History. And now to finish off, I will briefly tell you about some of my new work, which I have entitled Imperfect Offerings. Auschwitz, a triptych. This painting is about my mother and her survival in Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. She appears in the central panel as a flying bride clutching a menorah. I often portray her as a bride as a reference to the fact that she and my father met and shortly thereafter were married in the town of Ghetto. She's flying towards the rail entrance at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There are wolves running and bearing all their menacing teeth and tongues. The three parts of the narrative are unified by the rolling New Zealand hills, the chimneys of the crematoria bizarrely erupting behind the hills in the central panel, a still life of artifacts and treasures that are part of my actual environment in the here and now, with a few stones placed amongst fruits, shells, and painted ceramics. The stones symbolic of everlasting memory. A solitary shoe appears. Where is its pair? And where is the child who used to wear the shoe? The cutout dolls, another recurring motif, symbolizing the nameless dead. Grossrosen, a 6-paneled painting, honors the memory of my father. The top 3 panels are tied together with those rolling New Zealand hills, all intersected with barbed wire and theatrical concentration camp lights. The top central panel shows my father fleeing those crazed Alsatian dogs. In the top left panel, my mother is reaching out to my father as a beacon of hope and love. In the top right-hand panel, those dogs are hell-bent on reaching their victim. A hangman's noose swings in the darkness. Execution by hanging was a common form of punishment, which usually took place at roll call as a means of intimidating the other inmates. In the bottom left panel, the painter, me, appears with a banded crate draped around her neck. I use the snake and its ability to shed its skin as a metaphor for renewal and rebirth. He used to carry, in the central bottom panel, I appear as a child sitting on my father's shoulders. He used to carry me to bed in this fashion. The broken tree is a symbol of a life cut short and abruptly curtailed. That's me, crouched inside a see-through house. The images are of my childhood and recurring bad dreams. Sobibor, a quartet. An extermination camp located in a forest near the village of Sobibor in Poland. Geese, along with other livestock, were kept there. Some survivors have suggested that the geese were kept specifically for the purpose of drowning out the screams of the victims with their loud honking. They suggested that the honking agitated by the screaming guards and the frightened victims were part of the plan to mask the infernal noise at the gas chambers. It seems more likely that the geese were kept as a food source for the German staff. However, I couldn't get the other image out of my head. In this painting, there is a very lush still life. In the lower left panel of the artist is turned away from the viewer and she has a wolf sitting on her shoulder howling. There is a budgie perched on her head. This childhood pet appears in many of my works. The demise of this little bird was my first experience of death. The painter reappears in the top right-hand panel. She's crying while optimistically pouring a jug of water onto the flames. The gassed victims were burnt over a fire made of railway tracks. 3 Indonesian masks hang, overlooking the events unfolding within the painting. Masks often resemble human faces, but they are static, which makes them eerily lifeless, yet another metaphor for death. These paintings and several others will be exhibited at Aotearoa in April this year. Thank you very much for your very kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. You can see in the chat that people are just responding. Beautiful and thoughtful. And by the way, there was a chat, something in the chat, all your grandchildren are here today. I just want to recognize that. And we also have a few more comments about that. Someone wrote, I'm so moved by this program. In my own work, I also created something I call the alphabet of inadequate language, included in my recent book, Survivor Cafe, Elizabeth Rossner. And she also put in a link to that. But before we continue, and I know that Lilach has questions for you. I know this is a virtual opening of your exhibit, but we did want to show everyone where the exhibit is, at least to get a feeling of where the exhibit is. So I will do a share screen quickly, hopefully, if I'm allowed. Yes. Okay. So I will open this up and there we go. So I want to go back again. I kind of missed it, right? Okay, so we'll go back to the beginning. I kind of lost it because my computer goes left to right. Ah, okay. So now we have that. You can see Lilach at the entrance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oops. And if you move this out of the way, that would be nice also. Are these on canvas?
Yes.
And one more. And I know that someone asked in the chat if you use the whole alphabet. And so now we can say, yes, you can see the whole alphabet in the... So I will close my screen and let Lilach continue with the questions that she has prepared. And if we have questions after that, we'll continue. Lilach. You're still in mute, Lilach. Good.
Okay. So I would like to ask a few questions, Helen. That it was very curious to me, and I want to hear your question, your answer about it. You choose to do homage to Van Gogh and Matisse in the alphabet painting. Kindly elaborate.
Well, how much time have you got? I'll try and be very quick. Yes, homage to Matisse for sure. He's someone that I look at over and over again, and I'm totally amazed. I love his work, and Van Gogh as well. So yeah, I just couldn't resist using both of them, because I have looked at their work and thought about their work and just love their work, really. So there's no deep answer at all. I'm a fan.
Okay. And how did COVID impact your art?
Well, actually, COVID was wonderful for my art, because I tend to like being at home alone. And so I really had a really good excuse not to. So no, I worked really hard last year and found it was quite a wonderful time with very few interruptions. And yes, so it affected my art rather positively.
Well, it's good. one thing is good about it. Medine?
Okay, well, actually, we have someone wrote in the chat, Alan Bronner, and I don't know if I'm going to get the name of the camp right, so please excuse me. He says, hello, my mother was liberated in Neustadt Gleve on May 2nd, just as with Helene Carroll's mother.
I'm pleased today to be welcoming.
Yes, I hear someone. Okay. And he says that they would have been on the death march from Auschwitz to the railhead and then to Ravensbrück. If you could please send my message to her, and I have. And if you would like to talk with her, I will pass on his information as well. He also says that there was a story of a New Zealand pilot who was shot down over Neustadt Gleve with an accounting by another girl who was there. He says, thank you. He's from Fairlawn, New Jersey, and a place I know very well. Actually, someone asked if you were also influenced by Chagall.
Yes, how could I not be?
How could you not? Absolutely. The last painting that you showed, with the crying woman, even before that, absolutely. So I think you mentioned this when you were talking. Someone, Peggy Palmer, is asking if you find these pieces as therapeutic in the same way the clay was at the loss of your child.
Oh, it's a difficult question, but
it sounds like a difficult
probably.
question.
I mean, I suppose it is a hard question. Yes, I think so. I think making art is therapeutic. I need to do it.
I actually, because we have such a large art archives, and because we're all inspired by Miriam Novich, we also believe that art is therapeutic, but it's definitely, for us, it's also testimony. And I think testimony for second generation as well, to see how you are coping with the pain of your family story. So in that way, it's also very therapeutic, but also it's transferred on to us as well, the people that are looking at your artwork. I'm just checking one more time to see if there's anything else that people had asked. Please feel free, if anyone has a question, to add your questions here. When students can visit the exhibition, are there educational resources, time for students to respond creatively? Thank you, Carolyn. Dear, dear friend, my virtual friend. You know what? We'll invite you to come help us do an educational program. I don't think we've even had time to think about something like that, Lila. Is there an educational program prepared already for visitors? Well, we can't hear Lila, but I know she's saying yes. You're still in mute.
Oh, sorry. Yes, there is.
Wonderful.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
So Carolyn, I will share that with you when I find out what the program is. It sounds it looks like this is a wonderful, wonderful exhibition to work with students as well, to help them try to understand what it is to be the child of a survivor as well. So, and we have a question. Do you ever consider using the alphabet as an exercise for students to respond to? As in students invited to create their own alphabets?
Good idea.
And that is I think that would be something that would work very well. It's very similar to the type of workshops that we do. Children using art to respond to their experiences at the museum. And I think this would be a great opportunity to do that. If there's any inspiration from artists from the 20th century, I think we talked about, I think all the artists that we talked about are from the 20th century, Vladimir was asking. I don't see other questions. Of course, people are reacting to the educational aspect of your work, which I think is amazing. Actually someone is asking about how many displaced persons ended up in New Zealand.
Not very many.
Not very many, right?
Not very many. It's a very small Jewish community here in New Zealand. And there was just a very small window of opportunity for displaced people to come here at the time. I can't give you exact figures off the top of my head.
But I understand from what you're saying that it was a small community, and that makes sense, actually. But we're always surprised to hear about these opportunities for people to immigrate so far away from Europe. And like you said about your own family, they wanted to get as far away as possible. Okay. So actually someone is saying that their family arrived in 1951 in Wellington. So here we were getting feedback already. Okay, I think that we have answered questions, and we've heard an incredible story from Helen about your—
And you're welcome. They're all welcome.
Yes, yes, everyone is saying thank you, thank you, thank you, of course, in the chat box. Well, actually, someone is asking why you chose the English alphabet in particular. That's an interesting question as well. But I think that at this point, we are going to say thank you to Helen for coming to share with us your personal story, your family story, and of course, for sharing with us your beautiful, beautiful, inspirational artwork that I can hardly wait to see tomorrow when I finally get back to work after 2 months. And Lila, also, thank you so much for curating this exhibit. I don't think you could have found a better place to put this exhibit. It's in the entrance. Everyone who comes to the museum will see it. They will have a connection to it. And Dorit, thank you also for your support and for your story that I wish I had it translated in English, but I don't. And I want to say thank you to all our guests that came today. We were about almost 200 people today. And I hope that many of you will be able to come visit us in the near future at the Ghetto Fighters House here in Western Galilee, Israel. And what should I say? Good morning, good afternoon, and good night.
Thank you very much, Helen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Dorit. Thank you, everybody. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. People are just saying thank you in the chat box, so and saying goodbye. Oh, it's already tomorrow in New Zealand? Okay. Oh, that's
Sure
right. You guys are ahead of us.
Yes.
Ah, okay.